Part 4. The Voice. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Claire's scream. That final scream echoed through my head like a broken recording. Again, and again, and again. By midnight, I had listened to the voicemail more than 20 times. I was obsessed. I needed answers. The police couldn't explain what happened to Claire. Maybe the recording could. So I plugged my phone into my laptop and transferred the voicemail file. I put on headphones, turned the volume all the way up, and listened. At first, everything sounded the same. Claire's breathing, the footsteps, the man's voice. But after a while, I noticed something strange. Something I hadn't heard before. Right before the footsteps started, there was another sound. A whisper, so faint it was almost impossible to hear. I replayed it, again, and again. Finally, I caught a few words. At first, I thought I was imagining them. But the more I listened, the clearer they became. The whisper said, "Look up." I ripped the headphones off immediately. My heart was pounding. The words were so quiet they felt hidden, like they weren't meant to be heard. I sat there staring at the laptop screen, trying to convince myself it was audio distortion. Random noise, nothing more. But deep down, I knew what I'd heard. And for the first time, I thought about the attic. The attic above Claire's bedroom, the place where those footsteps seemed to come from. The next morning, I took the recording to the police station. The detective assigned to Claire's case was a man named Detective Harris. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept much either. I handed him a flash drive containing the voicemail. When I mentioned the footsteps, his expression changed, just slightly, but I noticed it. "You heard something too, didn't you?" I asked. The detective hesitated. Then he sighed. "We're still examining the recording." That wasn't an answer. "What aren't you telling me?" For several seconds he said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair. The coroner found something unusual. A knot formed in my stomach. "What?" Harris opened a folder. Inside were crime scene photographs. Most of them showed Claire's bedroom. Nothing looked out of place. Then he slid one picture toward me. I felt my blood run cold. The ceiling. There were scratches on it. Hundreds of scratches. Long, deep, parallel marks running across the plaster directly above Claire's bed, as if something had been dragging its nails back and forth for a very long time. I stared at the image, unable to speak. "Those weren't there a month ago," Harris said quietly. "What caused them?" The detective shook his head. "We don't know." I left the station feeling worse than before, because now there were more questions than answers. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the voicemail playing softly through my headphones. I focused on the man's voice, trying to hear something, anything. Then, suddenly I noticed it. The voice wasn't normal. There were two voices. The man's voice spoke first. But underneath it, there was another voice. A second voice layered beneath the first, lower, distorted, almost impossible to hear. I increased the volume, my hands trembling. The deeper voice seemed to be saying the same words, at the exact same time, like an echo, or a shadow. "Claire," the normal voice whispered, and beneath it came another sound. A voice that didn't sound human. A voice that seemed to vibrate through the speakers. My stomach twisted. I paused the recording. The room felt colder, much colder. Then my laptop screen flickered, once, twice, 3 times. Before going completely black, the room fell silent. I stared at my reflection in the dark screen, trying to understand what had just happened, and that's when I saw it. Something behind me, a figure, standing in the hallway outside my living room, tall, motionless, watching. My heart nearly stopped. I spun around. The hallway was empty. Nothing was there. No one, just darkness. When I turned back to the laptop, the screen suddenly came back on. The voicemail was still paused, but something had changed. The timestamp was different. The file had originally been 1 minute and 22 seconds long. Now it showed 1 minute and 26 seconds. For extra seconds, I stared at it in disbelief, my hands shaking. Slowly, I pressed play. The recording continued past the point where it had always ended. 4 seconds of audio that hadn't been there before. Static, breathing, and then a whisper, soft, close, directly into the microphone. A voice I recognized immediately. Claire, barely audible. Terrified, she whispered, "He's still here." The recording ended, and at that exact moment, something heavy slammed against the ceiling above my apartment. Part 5. The Police Discovery. The sound above my apartment shook the entire room. Bang. It wasn't a creak. It wasn't the settling of an old building. It sounded like something heavy had hit the ceiling directly above me. I jumped from my chair so fast that it crashed backward onto the floor. For several seconds, I stood frozen, listening, waiting, nothing. The apartment was completely silent. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen and forced myself to check upstairs. The building only had 3 floors. I lived on the second. There was an elderly man named Mr. Lawson living above me, a retired school teacher who could barely walk without a cane. There was no way he could have made a noise like that. Still, I climbed the stairs, my heart pounding harder with every step. When I reached the 3rd floor hallway, everything looked normal, quiet, empty. I walked to Mr. Lawson's door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again. A moment later, the door slowly opened. Mr. Lawson stood there wearing pajamas, half asleep, confused. "Ethan," he asked, "what are you doing here?" I looked past him. His apartment was dark, silent. "Did you drop something?" I asked. He frowned. "No." I felt my stomach sink, because I knew what I'd heard, and it hadn't come from his apartment. The next morning, Detective Harris called. His voice sounded tense. "Ethan, we checked the attic." My grip tightened around the phone. The attic, the place above Claire's bedroom, the place where the footsteps came from. "What did you find?" For a few seconds, he didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost nervous. "We found footprints." I stopped walking. "What kind of footprints?" "Human." A chill ran through me. The detective continued. The entire attic was covered in dust. Nobody had been up there in years. I swallowed hard. Then how were there footprints? Another pause. Because someone had been living up there. The words hit me like a punch. Living up there, above Claire. Watching her, listening to her. For how long? Weeks, months, years. I felt sick. Detective Harris explained that investigators found hundreds of footprints, stretching from one side of the attic to the other, back and forth, back and forth. The same path repeated over and over again, almost directly above Claire's bed, as if someone spent hours pacing there every single night. But that wasn't the worst part, not even close. "We found food wrappers," Harris said, "old water bottles, blankets." My hands started trembling. So someone was hiding up there. That's what we thought. The detective's voice became quieter until we checked the footprints. I didn't like the way he said that. "What about them?" "The size?" I waited. "The footprints were too large." I frowned. "What do you mean?" The detective exhaled slowly. "The average adult footprint is around 10 to 12 inches. My chest tightened. These measured nearly 19 inches. For a moment I thought I'd misheard him. 19 inches? That was impossible. No human foot was that large. At least not normally. I laughed nervously. It sounded ridiculous. The detective wasn't laughing. And that's not all. I closed my eyes. Of course it wasn't. The footprints weren't wearing shoes. My pulse quickened. Bare footprints. In the dust. For months. Maybe longer. "What about fingerprints?" I asked. "DNA?" "We found nothing. Nothing. Nothing." I sat down heavily on my couch, trying to process everything. Then Detective Harris said something that made my blood run cold. The footprints suddenly stopped. "What?" "They lead to the center of the attic. I pictured it in my head. A trail of dusty footprints crossing the attic floor, then ending, just ending. No return path, no exit, no ladder, no explanation. The detective continued, as if whoever made them simply disappeared. I couldn't speak. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then Harris cleared his throat. There's something else. A knot formed in my stomach. What now? The forensic team found marks in the wood. What kind of marks? Deep grooves. I immediately thought of the scratches on Claire's ceiling. The detective continued. They were directly above where her bed was located. I imagined someone lying awake in the darkness, directly over Claire's head, night after night, watching, waiting, listening. My stomach twisted. Then Harris said the words I'll never forget. We think whoever was up there knew her routine. The room suddenly felt smaller, colder, much colder. How do you know that? The detective hesitated, then answered, because written in the dust beside the footprints. His voice nearly became a whisper. Was her name? A wave of nausea hit me. What exactly did it say? For a long moment, there was only silence on the line. Then Detective Harris replied. It said. Claire finally looked up. The call ended shortly afterward. But that wasn't what kept me awake that night. What kept me awake was realizing something horrifying. In the voicemail, just before Claire screamed, the hidden whisper hadn't said, "Look up," it had said, "She looked up," and somehow, that made everything worse.